Welcome to our third lecture in behavioral neuroscience. And the question that we're going to ask today is, what is behavioral neuroscience? If we could try to capture what this field is all about and enable you to try to view the research that goes on in this area from a number of different vantage points. That's the goal. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what behavioral neuroscience actually is. And again, in just a few minutes, we will take a look at these major viewpoints that have become so essential for understanding the biological basis of what our behavior is a product of. So let's proceed along. So what is biopsychology? When we try to capture it in just a few words, it's the physiological components of behavior, evolutionary components of behavior, developmental components, mechanisms of behavior. That's what the field of behavioral neuroscience is really all about. And over the span of the next few minutes and next few slides, what I want to do is to try to illustrate this for you by giving you some, I think, concrete examples of what the discipline is all about. So let's begin to explore this. First, a little bit of divergence here. I want to, begin to introduce some important concepts in terms of the brain and the anatomy of the brain. And what you see here is what is called the dorsal view of the brain. In other words, we're viewing the brain from the top, looking down on the brain. This is a view that we call the dorsal view. Here's the front of the brain right here. Here's the back of the brain right here. We call this anterior. This is posterior. And if you take a look, again, here's the frontal lobe area of the brain, what is called the precentral gyrus right here. The central sulcus, that's this convolution that you see right here. The postcentral gyrus that you see right here, the parietal lobe, and the occipital lobe in the back of the brain. So again, this is just some basic terminology, things that are going to be coming up as we go along, and that you need to develop some familiarity with these basic concepts. This is another view of the brain. Again, instead of viewing the brain from the top, what we're doing is we're viewing the brain from the bottom. This is a ventral view of the brain. And again, the two different hemispheres of the brain. Here's the left hemisphere, here's the right hemisphere. And this is one of the things we're going to learn is this whole concept of laterality, that we have these two hemispheres of the brain, but they look identical to one another, but in fact, they're really very different in terms of their functioning. So again, here is what's called the longitudinal fissure right here. Okay, this is dividing the two hemispheres of the brain, and again, we're viewing the brain from the bottom. Okay, going up like this. Okay, instead of viewing it from the top, we're viewing it from the bottom. And here's our olfactory bulbs right here. Here's the temporal lobe of the cerebral cortex. This is the optic nerves that go from the eye to the back of the brain. Here's the medulla right here. Here's the cerebellum right here. And the spinal cord right here. So again, this is just another view of the brain. And we call this the ventral view. And again, here's the front of the brain right here. Here's the back of the brain. And again, we call this the front, the anterior, and the back, the posterior. This is a slide which shows brain tissue from a microscopic level. These are neurons in glia. The brain is made up of these two different types of cells. We're going to be talking a lot about this as we go along. Neurons typically convey information over a long span, and typically they convey messages to muscles and to glands, and this is over a great distance. Glia, on the other hand, are support cells. They are much smaller, typically, than neurons. They don't travel anywhere near as far, and they have a lot of different functions. We'll be talking about some of those functions as we go along. So again, the tissue of the brain consists of neurons and glia. So we want to try to understand what's called the mind-brain relationship. We want to try to understand the basis, the basic viewpoints that behavioral neuroscientists typically employ in their work. And typically in this field, we view or we try to explain behavior from 4 different perspectives. And those perspectives are the physiological level, or the physiological viewpoint, the ontogenetic viewpoint, what we call the evolutionary viewpoint, and the functional viewpoint. So what I want to do is I want to expand upon those, give you a little bit of an understanding of what those terms mean, and then what I want to do is I want to give you a concrete example of what we're talking about here in terms of these different perspectives, the different ways really of exploring or trying to understand behavioral neuroscience. So first of all, our physiological explanation. Essentially what we're saying here is that from this level of analysis, the behavioral neuroscientist is saying that they're really emphasizing the brain itself in terms of being the primary driving force of the machinery of the body. And the example that I like to give is that of neurotransmitters in the brain, hormones in the brain, which have many different functions, but one primary one is changing brain activity and changing how the brain is involved with influencing other organs and controlling muscles and muscle contractions. So this level of analysis then is, we're really looking at the nuts and bolts of the biology of our behavior, and the typical focus is on exploring these basic biological, basic physiological components of the brain and the degree to which they are involved in behavior. A second level of explanation is what we call the ontogenetic explanation, and what we mean by this is we want to know about the development of behavior and how that's related to the development of the anatomy of the brain. We want to know about genes. We want to know about how nutrition impacts these things. We want to know about how the environment influences our behavior, the social experiences that we have. So this is called the ontogenetic level of explanation. And by way of an example, we could explore the development of what we call inhibitory processes in terms of the maturing of the brain. We generally lack those inhibitory processes during the early months in the early few years of life. But this matures, and it matures with the development, especially of the frontal lobe area of the brain, which is generally involved as it develops in terms of inhibiting behaviors. Prior to that time, prior to that brain development, the organism is really operating almost exclusively in terms of how various emotional parts of the brain are dictating what goes on in terms of our behavior. So this is called the ontogenetic level of explanation, and indeed is a very important level of explanation in terms of trying to understand behavior. And we'll see examples of this as we go along. Another explanation, a third level of explanation, is what we would call the evolutionary explanation. And there are pressures that occur over the course of evolution that forces those mechanisms to either develop or to not develop in terms of many aspects of our behavior. A really good example of this is, you see a picture of a cat there that's been threatened by another cat, and typically what happens in that situation is the cat begins to show these involuntary kinds of responses, one of which is their hair standing on end as a response to being threatened, let's say, by a predator. The whole evolution of that behavior is very, very interesting, because what you see in the case of humans is that these goosebumps that are produced in the case of animals like a cat generally have lost their function in humans. You hear that statement all the time, his hair was standing on end. Well, that's a response, an involuntary response that really has been lost pretty much in the case of human beings in our evolution. But in the case of lower animals, it still serves a very important role. And in the case of the cat that you see here, it is in terms of being threatened by a predator, and that response of the animal's hair standing up like that can be a very threatening stimulus to another animal and make them a heck of a lot less susceptible to being attacked by another animal. But again, this is a function that's been lost in the case of the human being. So again, this evolutionary level of explanation is we're trying to reconstruct the history of a particular organism in terms of its behavior, so that we can understand just what those pressures are that have resulted in this evolutionary kind of a change. So again, this is another level of explanation. We also have what we would call functional levels of explanation, in which we're trying to describe why a particular structure evolved in the way in which it did, why a particular behavior evolved in the way in which it did. What you see there in that picture is a sea dragon, and sea dragons live typically amongst other plants in the ocean, kelp plants, and very often they look almost identical to that of plants. And the reason for that adaptation is a very clear one. It's serving to protect the sea dragon from predation. So again, this is another very important level of explanation, this functional kind of level of explanation. So let's pursue this a little bit more by giving another concrete example. When you take a look at certain species of birds that sing these beautiful songs, that singing behavior If we analyze it from those 4 different perspectives, you can see some very interesting uh, explanations for behavior. First of all, one of the things that we know is that males exhibit a lot of this singing behavior in many avian, many bird species. And there's an area of the brain in the male that is very responsive to the hormone testosterone. And when testosterone gets in circulation in the male, that primary male hormone is going to cause structural changes, morphological changes in that brain area that's responsible for singing behavior. Now, that's something that ordinarily you don't see in the case of females, because they don't have that hormone that you see in males. They don't have testosterone. So that brain area never really develops in the case of the female. We'll see later on when we get to reproductive behavior that you can cause development of that particular brain area that's involved in singing behavior. You can induce that in a female by giving female testosterone during very early life, that once she reaches adult life, it's going to show singing behavior and development of that brain area that's involved in singing behavior. So again, this is a physiological explanation for this behavior. When we look at ontogenetic explanations, one of the things that we know is that young males learn from older males. If you were to take a young male singing bird and isolate that male from other males from the time that they were hatched, what you would see is that bird song would not develop in that male that had been isolated. Clearly, the opportunity to hear songs from older males is very important in terms of the development of that singing behavior. So again, this is a level of explanation that we call the ontogenetic level of explanation. Experience. How does experience play an important role in terms of the development of that singing behavior? When we take a look at evolutionary explanations, one of the things that we know is that there are certain species of birds that have songs that resemble the songs of other birds, of other species. And what that suggests is that there's probably a common ancestor, that probably there's this commonality that occurs, perhaps in terms of the genes that are represented in the gene pool at that particular time, that certain species of birds have songs that do resemble those of other species. And again, that really suggests that there's a commonality there, that this probably was something that occurred as different bird species emerged. Their degree of relatedness in terms of the singing behavior is something that's been noted by scientists for a considerable period of time. So this would be an evolutionary explanation. When you take a look at functional explanations, why is it that a bird sings? Why is it that a male bird sings and generally a female doesn't sing? Well, one of the reasons why is that during the breeding season, males use this to attract females, and they also use it in a territorial function where they're warning other male birds to stay away from their territory. So the evolution of that singing behavior then is very important because it's improving the male's chances for mating and for survival of the species. So again, these are all the different levels of explanation that we have in terms of trying to understand the field of behavioral neuroscience. And most neuroscientists, most behavioral neuroscientists are working at one or more of these different levels in order to try to understand, what our behavior is a product of. So I think that this gives you a little bit of an introduction, more of an introduction in terms of where we're going with all this, and what we're going to be pursuing in our next lecture is what's called the mind-body problem. And that has, in terms of the history of the area of behavioral neuroscience, has been very important. So we will end this here. And proceed along in our next lecture to take a look at some of these issues that have to do with what we call the mind-body problem.